Eh, close enough. It's late. And what do they say? Late night. Don't feed a mugwai after midnight. So, and by the way, that mugwai I had to get off eBay because I literally went to 6 different Chinatowns. Yeah, 6. LA, San Francisco. I would say DC, but DC's Chinatown doesn't really exist anymore. Um, so I'm not counting that. um, Benando, the world oldest Chinatown in Manila, established in like the early 1500s. Uh, the Chinatown in Bangkok, the Chinatown in Kuala Lumpur, and Taipei, which I mean, I'm going to count that just because it's in China, it's Taipei. So, um, didn't go to Chinatown in Japan because I found out it wasn't in Tokyo. It's in a nearby city called, I believe, Yokohama. Mm. I think what is located in Tokyo is a little Korea, but Chinatown is in Yokohama, which is a city nearby the Tokyo metro region. Okay. Um, so I did actually find a Gizmo toy in Bangkok, but it wasn't in Chinatown. It was actually at it was actually at Pantip Plaza. There's a vintage toy store in Pantip Plaza. So people who don't know, so in Thailand, well, in Bangkok specifically of Thailand, but there's in other regions besides Bangkok, there is a IT shopping mall called Pantip Plaza. So there's more than one. I didn't know there's more than one, but there's several Pantip Plazas, and they're IT shopping malls. So you can get all your electronics and you know electronics, computers, stuff like that there. And the one I went to in I think it's called Nanthaberry in Bangkok, all the way at the top of the mall because it was like I think 5 levels. So at the top there was a vintage toy store. So shout out to Neverland Toys and Collectibles. So in Neverland Toys and Collectibles, they had a bunch of vintage stuff. They had like that Gizmo. Well, he's not really vintage. It's made by NECA. It's not the old one that was made in the 80s because I had that one when I was a kid. This was the one made by NECA. But they did have vintage stuff in there. They had like vintage arcades, both the full size ones and the little mini arcades they used to sell back in the 80s. By the way, the full size arcades were cheap. If I don't, if I if I translated the amount that it was from Thai baht to U.S. currency, I think it was like $100, maybe less. So it was that. It was a bunch of vintage stuff in there, and it was like newer collectibles in there as well. And the Gizmo was there. I don't know why I didn't buy it then. I think the only reason I didn't buy it is because I was so overwhelmed with so much stuff they had there. I wanted to buy everything, so I was so instead of just buying a Gizmo, I ended up just buying nothing because I wanted everything that I saw. So several years later, I was still searching for Gizmo. I saw one at the toy store here, but I knew I could get a better price for it on eBay. So that's what I eventually did. So, but I literally did go to every Chinatown, and I would either tell my wife or tell someone else I was talking to on the phone, I'm in Chinatown. I'm gonna find me a Mogwai. I said that every place I went. But anyway, Um, Off of that, I'm gonna get to the topic because it's late. So we're doing late night philosophy again. Um, so yesterday was sort of a ask me anything thing, ask me anything format. I didn't have any specific topic. I wanted to gear it towards Black History Month since it was the first day of February, but really didn't talk about that too much. Just talked about random stuff, which is what I do on Ask Me Anything Day. We just have random chats that usually brings in people to feel comfortable just, chewing the breeze with me. Okay. But most days I have a specific topic. So this is the day when I have another specific topic. I've been talking philosophy for the past week or so, and I've been calling it just late night philosophy. Basically to like kind of imitate the late night bull sessions people would have in college. Like people, would, usually in their first 2 years of college, they're like all excited about their major, and people would start talking about stuff, debating stuff they're learning. Especially when you're a sophomore, you there's a anyone who's gone to college knows the whole sophomore syndrome. The sophomore syndrome is where you think you know everything. Like you've been through an entire year of college, so you know more than probably typically the people you lived around back home. Um, but you still don't know very much, but you think you do. That's the whole sophomore syndrome. This is prop is between that junior is between that sophomore and junior year. You're gonna see the most just random late night discussions on stuff that you learned in school. People comparing stuff and saying, "Well, actually, in my course, we learned X, Y, and Z." And someone else will say, "Well, that's not what Professor so and so said. His book, he wrote the textbook, and he said that blah blah blah." So that's what I mean when I'm talking about late night philosophy, where it, I'm getting inspiration from the bull sessions I used to have in college with my friends, and something that a lot of people did back in college. Maybe not even college. You may have done this also in trade school, possibly in the military. Definitely in the military, we had bull sessions, but they weren't they weren't of the same caliber that you had in college. Like some of the bull sessions tended to be really stupid, funny but really stupid type of discussions. So that was a whole different type of thing. Um, Diago Gabriel says hello. What's up? Um, so this late night philosophy is going to be about realism versus uh, uh, relativism. Um, I've been keeping my discussions really kind of broad just because I don't want to get too specific since I know I'm talking with people who don't have a background in this sort of stuff. Although I do sometimes drop a lot of jargon. And when I do drop the jargon, I I go through a lot of painstaking to make sure people can understand what I'm saying. So realism, there's different versions of it, just like there's different versions of relativism. So I'm gonna be really general, but I'm gonna point out the different variants of each side. So realism in general means uh, a general viewpoint that the world is that there is an external world that we can grasp. There's a external world out there which we come in contact with. Not to mention our own internal workings. Trying to be very general, not use too much jargon. Relativism is um, deals with that reality isn't objective. It's basically a matter of different points of view. It's subjective, um, or that truth isn't objective. Yada yada yada. So I think you guys get the point. Rel- realism is, hey, there's an external world out there, and it's something that can be objectively identified, right? Where relativism is, well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but we it's all subjective. Um, Full cards on the table. I'm a realist, as most people who probably are of a scientific or philosophical bent usually are tend to be realists. But some people can be anti-realist on specific things while realists in general. So I'm gonna get into that. Um, Brandon says, "What's up?" Don't really answer to the unk thing, but cool. um, so yeah, so already, if there's any questions, you can lay it on me. Pause. But I don't, don't really see anyone in the chat room, so I might make this really brief, and it's late anyway. I want to go to bed. Um, so there's different versions. Like I said, there's different variants of realism, and there's different variants of relativism, which means that which means that you can be a a realist while being a relativist on certain matters, just like you can be a relativist, but maybe realist on some things. However, I think it's more inconsistent to say you're a relativist and then be realist on anything, to be quite honest. I think it's more, at least internally, consistent with being a realist, but maybe accepting that some domains of knowledge are relative. But I don't really find it internally consistent to say you're a relativist, but say that you're a realist on certain domains, because how, right? So let's get into it. So first, the most the most common version of realism is probably patently false, which is naive realism. Naive realism is the thought that the world is exactly as how we experience it. That's obviously not true. We know through neuroscience and through perception that um, the world isn't exactly how we perceive it. It's a lot of it has to do with how our brain processes sense our sensory experiences, which used to be called sense data in old philosophy jargon. Basically, like all the little lights, noises, and touches, and everything else that we externally sense. This would be sense data. Now we look at it, might just call it like sensory experience now. So our brain has to make sense of that, and how it makes sense of it may not actually be how things actually are in the real world. um, Again, relativists would just say it's all subjective, right? And they might point to the same sensory experiences as to say so, and they might use the same this um, they might use some of the same science as well. Say, hey, look, neuroscience shows all of this stuff is not real. We're just our brain just makes it seem real to us. Like they'll point to color, like we know that color isn't real. The different colors are just how our brain processes different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. So they'll point to something like that, like color, like, oh, that's relative. Or they might point to like personal taste. Personal taste is subjective. Hey, Agatha, she says hi, good night, sir. So personal taste, that's relative. I mean, that's subjective, right? Because our gustatory experiences are going to be different from each other. Although there are some objective parts of taste, because we all have these um, five different types of taste buds in our on our tongue and connected with our olfactory sense sense of smell. Sense of smell is very connected to your sense of taste. If you don't believe me, just remember the times when you had a cold and your nose was stuffed, and when your nose was stuffed, all your food tasted really bland, didn't it? Like you didn't. There was something missing from your taste of the food when you had a stuffed nose when you had that cold, right? Because since there is a connection between the olfactory sense, your sense of smelling, and your gustatory sense, which is your your oral tasting. Pause. uh, but but yeah, we have different. We have a sense of sweet, sour, um, bitter, salty, and the fifth one is umami, which was discovered like right around when I was in college because we were already talking about they were just four senses, four different taste buds, but the researchers were saying, I don't know. They were saying, well, we're looking into a fifth one, but we don't know exactly what it is now. Now we know what it is, which is umami, which is savory. So we have those five senses of taste: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and savory. So taste isn't completely subjective. But again, the relativists will point to things like personal taste and the experience and color perception and say these are the sort of things to show why reality is just subjective. Um, I guess it's true. Food has no taste. Yeah, when when you have a cold and a stuffy nose. Um, but again, there are some types of relativity that I do accept, but generally, I am a realist about the world. Um, but naive realism is false. Like naive realism is the viewpoint that the world is exactly how we experience it. That's just patently false because the way we experience the external world is filtered through our perceptual processes. So, um, so the other variant to that is scientific realism. Scientific realism is the belief that science aims to portray um, nature as it really is through our concepts, theories, and hypotheses. Now, for a lot of people, scientific realism is the default philosophy of science. Um, I'm a scientific realist, but after convincing arguments from people like Quine and others, many people who are philosophers of science have actually rejected scientific realism and instead believe in a uh, a sort of anti-realism to science, whereas they are still realists about the external world, but they reject scientific realism. They believe that science science simply gives us um, can simply just give us accurate measurements, but those measurements may not actually portray the real world. Um, I reject that, but there is a strong argument for it stemming all the way back to the great W.V.O. Quine, who was like the the, the philosopher's philosopher. Um, Unfortunately, he died as soon as I started philosophy, so I never got to meet him. Or you know, he was teaching at Harvard, but I'm pretty sure that um, being that he had connection with some of the philosophers that I learned under, that I might have ended up rubbing elbows with him at some like philosophy um, seminar or colloquium or whatever. So didn't happen because he died in 2000, unfortunately. And a lot of these philosophers die at pretty late ages. The ones who are like really into like math and logic, it seems a lot of them tend to um, have really long lives because maybe it's something very healthy about doing a lot of really dry math and logic. I don't know. Well, there needs to be um, some study on that if they haven't already. Anyway, he lived to be about 90 something, I think. As did people like Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein didn't, but I think he died of cancer though. So, um, in any case, getting back to the subject, so I forgot the term for the anti-realism in philosophy of science, but at least half of philosophers of science now embrace it. But and I think it's mainly because of their frustration with how to interpret contemporary physics. I think that is what fuels a lot of this anti-realist sentiment about philosophy. Again, not that these people are anti-realists, just that they're anti-realists about scientific research. Okay, so scientific realism, and then there's mental realism. Again, I'm a mental realist as well. Mental realists believe that there are actual like mental structures, innate knowledge, um, and that thoughts are sometimes real that cause external behavior. These are mental realists or mentalists, sometimes as they're called, to differentiate them from people who are anti-realists about the mind. These would be radical behaviorists. Radical behaviorists say that not just that. So regular scientific behaviorism was a research program that basically said that scientific psychology can only be a matter of studying behavior, and that's it. We can't make any inferences beyond just people's behavior or their dispositions to behave in a certain way. Radical behaviors go beyond that and say not only can we only study be, people's or animals behavior, but that there's all but that's all that there is. There is no mental structures behind the behavior. It's just a matter of behavioral conditioning. That was a that was a pretty that was a radical thought at the time, but it was widely embraced up until like the 60s, when the cognitive revolution came about and people started embracing believing in like internal mental structures and stuff like that through people like Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor. There's also people called radical connectionists. These are sort of like the modern take on behaviorism, where they will um, it's not that they don't admit that there is a mind, but that they deny like all they basically deny all this internal structure. They believe that it's just a matter of the neural connections, and this we could explain like all of behavior and our mental processes through neural connections. So they're called radical connectionists because of that. um, then the most extreme of them are the eliminativists. The eliminativists say, given an advanced neuroscience, we have no need to ever invoke talk of the mind except as a way of colloquially talking about these sorts of things to get along with it. Like they believe that we'll keep using mental talk, but just as a colloquial way of talking about the brain, but that they won't really have any actual reference to any of these terms and concepts. Sort of similar to like how we still talk about um, how we move about the world as if the world is sort of like at the center of the center of the solar system. Like we talk about how things revolve around the Earth instead of actually how the Earth revolves around the sun and all that sort of stuff. Especially as a sailor, there's still a lot of like antiquated. talk about how they navigate the seas and stuff like that in a way that imply that they still implicitly believe that the world is at the center, but we know that's not the truth. But there, limitativists, excuse me, basically say the same thing. What's up, Howard? They're basically saying, hey, there is no mind. There's just a brain, and the mind is just a folksy way of talking about the brain, and that's it. So these are called eliminativists. It's sometimes called a eliminative materialist. That's the same thing. If you ever come across that, if you go to like, if you get nerdy enough to or curious enough to go to like the Stanford Encyclopedia online or any of those other online sources, and you hear about eliminative materialists or eliminativists, they're the same thing. These are basically people who believe there is no mind, there's only the brain, and the mind is just of, of a old folksy way of talking about the brain, and that given enough advanced neuroscience, we will never have a need to talk about the mind again. So these are the people who would be anti-realists against um, the mental realists. You guys still with me? Did your eyes cross yet? Now, often when people are talking about relativism um, in everyday talk, they're not really talking about metaphysical relativism, which is what we're talking about now, metaphysical realism versus metaphysical relativism. They're usually talking about something like some sort of cultural relativism or moral relativism, and I reject those as well. The, the reason I reject both cultural and social relativism is if you say that those things are relative, then you have no square to stand on to say that anything is wrong that you see going on in the world. Now, if you're comfortable with that, now some people are can be consistent and say, yeah, I'm just going to say that none of these things are actually wrong. It's just my matter. It's just a matter of personal distaste. So if someone's willing to be that consistent, then I salute them. But I think it would be wild as fuck. There, there's a notion amongst philosophers that a philosopher can, given a clever enough argument, will embrace any wild idea, which is both a strength, which is true, and it's both a strength and a weakness of philosophy that we can accept. That given a clever enough argument, we will accept any crazy idea. But yeah, so there are people who will believe that you know, out of consistency for their relativism will just say, yeah, all these things that people find to be tragic, to be human misery and suffering, that's just a matter of personal distaste. That's crazy. So this is why I'm against moral relativism in its absolute form, at least, and cultural relativism, at least in its absolute forms. Because again, if you're absolutist about those things, there's nowhere to actually say certain things are wrong. Caden says hi. How are you doing? I'm doing all right. So, like I said, if you accept those in absolute terms, then there's no square to stand on and say, hey, uh, unaliving people is wrong. Genocide, that's wrong. Trafficking, that's wrong. Slavery, that's wrong. Stealing people's homes, that's wrong. You can't like to be able to say these common sense things, you wouldn't be able to do it. Now, again, I said the absolute forms because milder, there are weaker forms of moral relativism and cultural relativism that might be more rational. Um, so for instance, within the world of morality and ethics, one might say that it's domain relative, which is to say that although metaphysically, it has no objectivity to it. That within that domain of knowledge or that domain of interest or whatever, there are certain standards and principles. So that's domain relativity, where you can say that maybe uh, a certain phenomena or domain of study. Within that domain of study, there are certain objective standards and principles by which to study it and come to know more about that information. Um, Cultural relativism, where I see it can have use, is in social and behavioral research, where obviously if you trying to do research on different uh, different different groups from which you are not a part of, or even if you are a part of that group, if you don't have a certain if you don't have a certain distance away from that, if you already have like really strong views on it, you won't be able to do good research. So this is where cultural relativity actually has merit, is when you're doing social and behavior research. If you say, well, I'm not going to have any preconceived notions of value towards this people or this group or these folks in this country or this religion, whatever, it helps you more objectively study that um, that topic, right? So if you're a Christian but just studying pagan worshippers, you might want to you might want to fall back on your own faith when learning about these other people's belief system, because otherwise it will taint your research. So this is where cultural relativism has some merit, but like I said, in general, like social cultural relativism, moral relativism, if you take it to their absolute, or if you follow it all the way, it will leave you in a place where you can't discern the fact that certain cultures have values that lead to their ruin, whereas other cultures have values that lead to them being successful. You won't be in a position to say that because you'll be at odds with saying, oh, all these cultures are equal, and they're not. Same thing with morals. If you say, well, they just simply aren't any morals, or that they're all just subjective, or they're just a matter of personal taste, then you won't be able to describe why certain behaviors cause suffering and misery to others. Um, Kaden says, I'm going to help you out and subscribe to you. Appreciate it. Howard says, I had an Iraqi sheik tell my team once, we Americans are the strongest tribe. I never thought of us as a tribe. That's kind of cool to think of all Americans as just one tribe. That's kind of cool. But yeah, so like I said, if it, it would just be insane to not admit that certain culture, like, but people really do try this, especially in college, particularly in college. People will try so hard to claim that no culture is better than the other, and it's just patently false. Obviously, some cultures are better than the others. Not saying some people are better than others, but some of their cultural values are better than others. Uh, a culture that puts high value on things like education and family, uh, things like honesty and integrity, they tend to do better than um, cultures that value selfishness, um, being loathsome, um, mocking people for their ambition or love of education sounds familiar. I'm not going to point out any particular community here in America, but if it sounds if those two sound like any particular ethnic communities you've heard of, let the shoe let if the shoe fits. But yeah, so yeah, it's just so those are the sorts of relativism outside of metaphysical relativism that most of the time people often talk about. Like I said, most of the time people aren't talking about metaphysical relativism. They're talking about social. They're talking about like cultural relativism or moral relativism. When people talk about social constructs, that's they're also referencing relativism, because when they say, "Oh, gender is just a social construct," they're basically saying that it's just relative. And as I've pointed out in a number of different videos, it's 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 incoherent, and this is gender ideology is very incoherent because of their embrace of saying that gender is a social construct. But then they but if it's if it's a social construct, meaning that it's has no object, there's no objectivity to it, then it shouldn't be able to cause so much distress. It shouldn't determine behavior. Something that has no objectivity to it should not be able to determine people's behavior. But they're at is very gender ideology is very incoherent in the thought that they want you to embrace the idea that gender is a social construct, meaning it has no objectivity, while also while also wanting you to embrace the idea that it determines certain behaviors. No, if if something has causative powers, it has to be objective. This is again why behaviorism was rejected in scientific psychology after the 60s, because we saw that that there was a lot of things going on outside of mere behavioral conditioning that was causing behavior in the animal subjects as well as in um, the human participants in different sorts of social studies. Um, where else I want to go with that? So then, ultimately, when we're talking about metaphysical relativism versus metaphysical realism, we're going to get into ideas of truth. Doc says, "Good evening, brother. Just been looking at what to raise in the garden this year." So, like I said, when we get into realism versus relativism, one of the things that's going to strike out is obviously the notion of truth. Um, and it's funny, most people until 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 it's most people until it's challenged usually have a subjective definition of truth. Most people say, well, truth is subjective, or they say truth is what you want it to be, or they talk about my truth, which is the most annoying thing I've ever heard. um, Even before I learned more about truth in philosophy and stuff like that, I always used to just roll my eyes when people said, "This is my truth," which is it's just a roundabout way of saying this is what I believe. It doesn't mean it's actually true. This is just saying, "Hey, this is what I believe." When people say, "This is my truth," like that doesn't make sense. If something is true, it's not going to be just true for you. And people don't even realize it's self defeating to talk about truth as being subjective, because, because think about it. If you make the claim that truth is subjective, if that claim itself is true, then it's an objective truth for everyone that truth is subjective. But then you just stated that it's subjective. So that's a self contradicting claim. So to say that truth is subjective, you're actually asserting a claim that if it is true, then it would be objectively true for everyone. But if it's objectively true for everyone, it would be false because the claim itself states that truth is subjective. And people don't realize when they reject the tools of reason that they have to use the tools of reason to actually build an argument for why you should reject reason. It's self-defeating. It's very self-defeating. And and it doesn't take long to realize why a subjective definition of truth doesn't work. On top of that, if on top of the fact that the claim itself is a self contradiction, let's say that it wasn't a self contradiction, even if so the other problem would be it would make mutual communication between people impossible because everything people say will have a different meaning just to them. Your meaning of your whatever you utter or assert would be true to you, but would have a completely different meaning for someone else, or no meaning at all, possibly. So mutual communication would be impossible, and we couldn't have logic and math, which means we also couldn't have science. So the the so the whole view of truth is subjective is just a utterly self-defeating claim. Guys, tracking. I know it's only one person listening right now, but I know some people will be watching this broadcast in a replay. So this is why I keep talking, because people. So for people watching this on replay, I always get flack from the one or two people actually watching. They'll be like, "Hey, bro, there's only one of us here. There's only two of us here." I'm like, "Yes, I get that, but people will watch this on the replay, so this is for them." Because I get paid through the views that people watch this on replay. Unless I'm getting super chats or some other donations here, I depend on this being uploaded and replayed for those folks to watch later. Okay, so to answer that, because people will always ask me that each time when they don't see any numbers posted in the chat room. Anyway, moving on. So again, I think we can throw away the subjective concept of truth because one is self-defeating, and two, if it were if the subjective definition of truth wasn't was actually plausible, it would actually make effective communication utterly impossible. So then there's other notions of truth, like there's the correspondence theory of truth, an epistemic theory of truth, um, semantic theory of truth, um, and there's many others. But most people nowadays adhere to some sort of deflationary theory of truth. So, for instance, the one that I usually go by because it's the easiest to understand is the redundancy definition of truth. And you're gonna be like, "Yeah, that's really stupid" when I tell you this, but it does. But it gives us a good guideline, and it shows how truth is objective without getting into a metaphysical theory of truth. So we don't have to get into a metaphysical theory, any other sort of correspondence theory or epistemic theory, and we can do away with uh, relativism, metaphysical relativism. And so the redundancy definition of truth is simply the sentence P is true if and only if P. And if I instantiate an actual sentence for the letter P, for the variable P, we'll say the sentence snow is white is true only if snow is white. So it seems like there's some sort of underlying metaphysical aspect to it, but it's also very deflationary. Like you can just say, yeah. the snow, the sentence "snow is true" if and only if snow is. I mean, the sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white. Oh, snow is white, then oh, the sentence is true. There you go. It's a deflationary theory, um, but it's that one's specifically called the redundancy definition of truth because it is redundant, but it's not. Even though it's redundant, it's not a vicious circularity to it. I mean, it seems a bit circular, but it's not a vicious circularity that means it just gives you no information outside of itself. Like it gives you a working definition of truth, which is the redundancy concept. Okay. So, and again, it establishes that it's objective, but basically it replaces truth with instead of it being metaphysical, is now a semantic. It's a semantic property of truth becomes a semantic property of our assertions. And the funny thing is, tr- the the most basic principle of logic, the principle of bivalence, is presupposed by the very notion of truth. Anyway, the principle of bivalence. I know people's eyes are crossing right now. Let me just say it. I'm keeping it very simple. Trust me. The principle of bivalence simply states that for any assertion, um, that assertion can only have one truth value, and that's either true, and um, that truth value is either true or false. It's related to the principle of the excluded middle, but the principle of the excluded middle is based on the principle of bivalence, which is a more basic uh, logical law, if you will. All of first order logic is based on the principle of bivalence. The notion of truth itself presupposes the principle of bivalence. And even if you get into the higher type of logics, so-called second order logic or meta logic, many of those second order logics, even though they can do away with the principle of bivalence, you can still use the principle of bivalence in those second order logics, even though it may not be necessary to do so because they have more, those sort of formal languages have more tools to be more expressive than first order logic can be. But anyway, the point is that truth is not subjective. To say truth is subjective is just a self defeating claim. And if it were true, it would make effective communication impossible. So there we are with that. Um, unless I get more, unless I get more communication on this, I mean more feedback from the chat room, I'm probably going to end this soon because it's late for me and there's no need to keep harping on this unless people are interested. I know I'm talking about some really eye crossing stuff, but it's very interesting to me though. So someone may watch this on replay and be actually interested. Some people who know a lot more than me would be like, man, he really mucked that up, didn't he? And I'm all for the corrections, but only from people who actually know this subject, not from people who took one philosophy class and think they can debate me. That's not going to happen because as it stands, I'm simplifying this stuff a lot. I think the test of how well you know something is how well you can simplify it to the layman who's never known this information and you know give them that information. So anyway, I'm trying to think of some other forms of relativism and realism since, like I said, there are many variants. And like I said, I am a realist. I am a scientific realist, and I'm a mental realist. Um, or, or sometimes called psychological realism. Same thing. Um, it was another one that um, Oh yes, it's just so the other one, which is going to definitely make people's eye cross, is that I'm also a realist about mental representations. That's called representational realism. So the reason I'm mentioning it is because I earlier pointed out that naive realism is patently false. Again, naive realism is the thought, is the viewpoint that the world is exactly how we experience it, and we know that's just simply not true because we we experience the world through all of our perceptual processes in our brain, and that leads to a different type of realism called representational realism, which is the um, the idea that most of the things that that we perceive comes through um, our ability to utilize mental representations. And I could like go on for like 5 minutes explaining what mental representations are, because I literally did a whole graduate course in mental representations where on one of the exams we had to give like a page long definition of it. But suffice to say, I'll I'll make it very simple. The mental representations basically are symbols, um, usually of a lot. They're symbols usually of a logical syntactical form that carry information and are manipulated by our brain for the purposes of knowledge. I think that is the most general way to explain mental representations. Zen Photon says all things being of a physical or material substrate should be considered more in nature, in parentheses essence, instead of event rather than object. Um, I think you're trying to be too clever than you need to be, bro. So you're touching on something that I actually spoke about on a previous stream, which is talking about physicalism, and I did physicalism versus dualism, and I really should have made it physicalism versus idealism, but I did mention idealism in that previous live stream. Whereas when I say physicalism, this is the general philosophical view that everything that exists is somehow um, is in essence physical, meaning it's all like matter and energy or whatever, as opposed to dualism, um, which says that that the mind and the matter are of two different essences, to use Zen Photon's words, but that basically the the brain basically it splits things between the brain and the mind, depending on the type of dualism we're talking about. And I went into pains to describe the different types of dualism versus the different types of monism, which physicalism is a type of monism. Monism is the philosophical view that all things that exist are just of one substance. Physicalism says they're all physical. Idealism says they're all mental phenomena, and neutral monism says they're all one thing, but is a yet is of a yet to be described thing. um, then there was three different types of dualism. So I described Cartesian dualism, which is a type of substance dualism, which is to say, Descartes believed that the the uh, the physical world and the brain are of one thing, and the mind is of a different thing. Of course, he also said that there was a third essence, which was God Himself, which was different in both the physical world and the mind. But there's always been this debate in philosophy whether he actually meant that or he just said that to sort of placate the Catholic Church at the time. We don't know. Uh, and then there's property, and then there's other types of substance dualism. besides the Cartesian dualism, but his is the most well-known version of it. So that's what I concentrated on in that previous live stream. But also went to, but also went into, you know, and I went into other types, which is like property dualism, which is more sophisticated look at it, saying that um, yeah, it was okay. Well, the brain and mind and all that sort of stuff is physical, cool, but there are mental properties that are separate from both the mind brain, because they'll property dualists will give it to the physicalists and people who study these sorts of matters like neuroscientists and psychologists. Well, okay, you guys got it. The brain and the mind are identical. Sure. Okay, cool, you got it. But the mental properties themselves are a different thing. So that's where they differ. And then there was other types of dualism and stuff. But anyway, that wasn't what I'm talking about today. So, but if Zen Photon wants to check that out, he's more than welcome to go visit that previous live stream, which is called Late Night Philosophy, Dualism versus Physicalism. So have at it. But today I was just talking about realism versus relativism. And basically I was trying to make the case that realism is a more is a falls more into view uh with common sense, but that the type of realism that most people embrace is false, which is naive realism. And most people embrace a sort of naive realism, which is, yeah, the world is pretty much as we see it. That's not real. I mean, that's not true. Sorry. Um, Unfortunately, we, the world is filtered through our perceptual and cognitive processes. So most cognitive scientists and others embrace sort of representational realism, which is that um, the way we view the world is through our mental representations. And again, mental representations are symbols of a logical syntactical form, which carry information and are thereby manipulated by our brain for the purposes of knowledge. Okay? Um, and then I also um, said I embrace scientific realism, which is that um, scientific tools like concepts, theories, hypotheses, and research aim to portray uh, the world the way it actually is. Okay, and also embrace mental realism, which is that um, there are certain mental phenomena which are aren't merely subjective; they're actually real. Okay, and then I contrasted these with all the different types of relativism, which are again metaphysical relativism, which is there's no objective reality. Everything is just smoke and mirrors. Especially like say if you come from certain Eastern philosophies, they really push the whole relativism thing, particularly in uh, particularly in different versions of Buddhism. They really push the notion that everything we're experiencing is merely subjective. That is the reality is out there somewhere, but not here. What we experience is all just you know subjective. It's illusory. And I think aside from the fact that that's just patently false, it's actually a dangerous idea to teach people that everything they're going through in the external world is all illusory and subjective. Because if you do so, it keeps them from ever trying to do better than where they're at. I mean, obviously, the view that everything is subjective and illusory works out well for you if you're living well in life. If you come from a privileged background, you live in a safe and healthy place, then it's fine to say, oh, all of this is illusory and subjective because you don't have to worry about it. But when you know, you live a horrible life, Just telling someone is subjective and illusory, besides it just being kind of stupid telling them that. I mean, it would keep them in a if they were to actually believe it, it would keep them in a position where they would not look to get out of a bad situation, right? So that's my nitpick of Buddhism and other religions like that that often try to teach people that the real world is just illusory and subjective, and that the real world is waiting out there after death. No, no, no. And I'm not going against anyone's particular faith. I'm just saying that any faith that tells you that what you're the world in which you live currently is all illusory and subjective, it's it's I find that a dangerous idea. Okay, this is why people like Karl Marx will say that religion is the opiate of the masses, because that is a very sedative sort of idea that the world is illusory and subjective, so that it keeps people in their place. That's why he was talking about uh, religion is because the term is often misused when, and it's also a very shortened form of what he actually said. But within the context of he saying religion is opiate of the masses, that's what he was basically saying, that as if you view history as a record of class struggle, then religion has been used as a tool to sedate people into believing that, you know, where their lot in life is where they ought to be, and that they can't, and that they shouldn't look for better because all of this is illusory, and the real world is waiting for them after they pass away. So while all the rich and privileged and elite get to live a life of abundance and happiness here, all you poor folk, all you people struggling in war torn countries and all other sorts of stuff, hey man, you just need to pray so you can get to that good place. And also, I touched upon relativism that isn't metaphysical. I touched on moral relativism and cultural relativism, and I tried to explain why I find those dubious. Because if you if you take the strong forms of each of those views, it leaves you in a position where you can never question um, things that cause human misery and suffering. You can't point to certain things and say those sort of things are wrong because they cause unjust harm and suffering to other people. You can't point to stuff and say slavery is wrong, genocide is wrong, unaliving people is wrong, stealing from people is wrong, taking people's homes is wrong, invading other countries is wrong. Um, you, you can't say that assaulting women is wrong. You can't say any of these things because from your viewpoint, all these things are subjective. The most you can say is that it's just personally distasteful to you. That's just dumb. But I did defend that there can be some relativity with those things because obviously morals aren't completely objective. There's nothing like the, although we can say certain human behaviors are wrong, certain institutions are morally wrong. We can't point to any particular objective thing in the world and say that itself is moral or immoral. So the moral relativists do win that battle. They just don't win the whole war. And I went into a lot of that in a previous live stream as well. Why? When I talked about is morality objective or subjective? I did a whole live stream on that too. And with cultural relativism, similar situation. We're at a pains to explain why certain people in certain cultures do really well and why some do really poorly. Because especially in academia, we're always taught cultural relativism, that you can't judge other cultures by by our own standards, because that would be considered ethnocentrism. Yes and no. Now, for the purposes of research, yes, there should be a certain standard of, there should be a certain scientific cultural relativism where you step away from your own your own views on people's culture and practices so that you can objectively study them. But outside of scientific research, there's no reason to be a cultural relativist, because there are certain cultures that are bad and certain that are good. If a certain culture leads more often to misery, whereas another one most often leads to success and happiness, obviously that's the better one. Like I said, if you have a certain culture that glorifies degeneracy, whereas you have another culture that embraces education, ambition, family, and stuff like that, I wonder which one is going to do better. So, and then finally, I went over how um, one of the central concepts in the debate between relativism and realism is the notion of truth itself, and I said why ultimately any subjective definition of truth is self-defeating, because if you say that truth is subjective, you're making a claim, which if true would actually be objective, because for truth to be subjective, there would have to be a claim that is true of everyone. um, but if that's the case, then it's also false, because the claim itself asserts that truth is subjective. So it's a patent self contradiction. And then even if you take out the problems of it being self contradictory, it's also the problem that if truth is subjective, then human communication would be impossible, because any assertion someone makes would have a different truth value than for the person making a claim to the person receiving the claim. It would make communication utterly impossible, which will also make logic impossible, which will make math and science impossible. And then I said that there's other definitions of truth, like metaphysical theory of truth, epistemic theories of truth, correspondence theories of truth, um, and many others. And and I said there's probably either the semantic theories or deflationary theories, which are probably the most salient, particularly the deflationary truths, because it leaves um, truth as a semantic property of our assertions, whether you want to say those assertions are propositions, sentences, statements, whatever. We can be neutral on that. We can just say generally assertions have truth value, and those so and that notion of truth itself presupposes the very basic principle upon which all logic is built, which is the principle of bivalence, which says that for any assertion, that assertion can only express one truth value, and that truth value is either true or false, which makes, again, truth something objective. And the funny thing is, if people try to disagree, they're still presupposing that very principle. In fact, in general, when people try to argue against reason, they have to use the very tools of reason to argue against it, self defeating. So that's where we're at. I'm going to end this here because I don't see much talk on this, and it's late here. It's 11:25 on my end. I have stayed up much later doing these streams, but I've been going to bed much earlier as I should be have been doing. So that's where we're going to end this, guys. Appreciate it. But I'll give it a few seconds if anyone has any questions or comments. And If not, and people still want to discuss it further, they can leave those questions or queries or thoughts in the comment section. I'll look at them. Also, if you want to support me, you can do so by the memberships. I do have memberships for the channel, and I do have content just for members only that you can see. Uh, there's not a lot, but there's also not a lot of members. Once I have, the more members I have, the more members only content I will generate for you guys. Or you can leave me a super thanks to show support as well. Or you can leave me one of these rubies on here. Um, but I think that's only while I'm live streaming. But if you're watching this in replay, you can leave a super thanks, or you can sign up for a membership, or you can hit me up on Cash App. The links will be in the description of the channel as well as this video as well. Um, but other than that, appreciate it, guys. Thank you for letting me nerd out. Okay, I'll be back with a few more philosophy topics this week, and I will take suggestions for topics as well. Agnes is good night. Thanks, Agatha. Did that make sense, Agatha? I know it's a lot of I crossing stuff, but did did that stuff make sense? And I went over it twice just to make sure that people caught what I was saying. Because hopefully that like hopefully people understood what I was saying. I tried to simplify it as much as possible. Oh, you said yes, totally. Thank you, thank you. All right, guys, that's it for me. I'm out 5,000. If you never heard that phrase, it's from the 80s, maybe early 90s. I don't know, but yeah, Audi 5,000. I haven't said that in so long since I was a kid, but whatever. Um, better go. I gotta feed Gizmo before it turns to midnight. Don't need any gremlins walking around here. We already got enough of those in Baltimore. um, but aside from that, guys, like I said, if you guys got any questions, leave it in the comments. If you want to show me support, you can do so with memberships, or you can send me a super thanks, or you can cash at me, and the links are in the description. You can also buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com. I do drink a lot of coffee. You can ask me the moderators, or you can look at my previous videos. I'm always drinking iced coffee if it's the daytime, so I can stay up. And it was only through coffee I was able to stay up this late. All right, but I appreciate it, guys. Have a great night. For you folks overseas, have a great day. Appreciate it. I got some interesting content coming up in the next week. Not this week, next week or the week following, involving Mrs. Contrarian. So, guys, well, I'll talk to you later. Thanks, Howard. Thanks, bro. All right, guys, talk to you later. Peace.